Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling a really significant and, well, ongoing story in global economics, the trade situation between the United States and China.
It's definitely a big one.
Yeah, and to get a handle on this, we've pulled together quite a range of materials. We've got analyses on trade gains and losses, a Wikipedia timeline of how the trade war unfolded.
Which is surprisingly detailed.
Right. Also, a recent White House report, this one's from April, outlining their America First trade policy.
And we've also looked at some findings on the global bystander effect, which is interesting. Plus, a USDA report on how retaliatory tariffs hit U.S. agriculture.
And some expert commentary just trying to make sense of the broader U.S.-China relationship.
So our goal here really is to give you a clear picture. It's a complex issue, no doubt.
Definitely.
We want to explore, how these trade frictions started, what the key moments have been, the impacts both here and in China,
Yeah.
and maybe what current policy tells us about the future.
Think of it as your guide through the noise, trying to get to the core of this ongoing story. Okay, so let's get right to it. Where did this all begin? That Wikipedia timeline is a good starting point. It reminds us that Donald Trump's 2016 campaign really put trade protectionism front and center.
It really did. And that wasn't just campaign talk, it carried over. A key moment was August 2017 when he directed the USTR, the U.S. Trade Representative, to investigate China's economic practices.
And what was the focus there?
Well, the report that came out March 2018, it really zeroed in on this idea of alleged forced technology transfer from U.S. companies to China.
Right.
The USTR, they handle these trade matters, and their report put a massive figure on the estimated cost to the U.S. economy. Somewhere between, $225 billion and $600 billion a year?
Wow. That's a huge range, but still, huge number.
Absolutely. And that report really set the stage for the initial actions the U.S. took.
And those actions came pretty fast. We saw the U.S. imposing tariffs on Chinese goods. Right?
Yeah, tariffs started rolling out.
And they also took a case against China to the WTO, the World Trade Organization.
They did. Plus, restrictions on Chinese investment, particularly in high-tech sectors in the U.S.
Looking at that timeline again, those early months, May to September 2018, they were really packed.
Oh, absolutely packed. You had China canceling orders for things like soybeans. That was a big early signal.
A real shot across the bow for U.S. agriculture.
Definitely. Then there were some trade talks, which maybe offered a bit of hope. But then, almost immediately, both sides announced and then implemented tariffs on billions and billions of dollars worth of goods.
Right. And it wasn't just a one-way street. China filed its own complaint with the WTO about U.S. tariffs on solar panels, I think.
That's right, solar panels. It just shows how quickly things escalated and how many different sectors got pulled in right from the start.
And the scale of the trade involved here,
Yeah.
it's just enormous. The analysis we have, the one on the bystander effect, it mentions the U.S. put tariffs on about $350 billion worth of Chinese imports.
Yeah, and China hit back with tariffs on roughly $100 billion of U.S. exports going the other way. And that's just in those first couple of years, 2018, 2019.
It's a massive disruption.
It really is. The Center for Economic Policy Research, CEPR, they even compared it to the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act back in the 30s.
Which is infamous for protectionism.
Exactly. And the CEPR analysis actually points out that these U.S.-China tariffs potentially affected an even larger share of U.S. imports than Smoot-Hawley did. We also saw just dramatic jumps in the average tariff rates.
So how high did they go?
Well, the data shows the average U.S. tariff on Chinese goods went from just over 3% in 2017 to over 24% by August 2019.
Wow, a huge increase.
And China's tariffs on U.S. imports also jumped significantly, from about 8% up to nearly 21% by June 2019.
And that America First Trade Policy Report, the recent one from April, it really leans into this idea of tariff disparities, doesn't it?
It does. It highlights the U.S. perspective that average tariffs in places like the EU, China, India, Brazil, they're all higher than U.S. tariffs.
They give specific examples, too, like cars, U.S. tariffs on cars being lower than elsewhere.
Right. And things like apples. The U.S. has no tariff, but India and Turkey do. It builds this picture, from the U.S. standpoint, of an uneven playing field.
The report also talks about non-tariff barriers, right? Things beyond just taxes.
Exactly. Obstacles like specific regulations, product standards, limits on market access. They mention EU restrictions on U.S. shellfish or UK standards for beef and poultry.
So it's painting a picture of a global trade landscape that the U.S. feels isn't always fair or reciprocal.
That's clearly the message conveyed in that report.
Okay, so let's talk about the impact. What were the real-world effects of all these tariffs on the U.S. economy? We saw that UN analysis suggesting it hurt both countries.
That seems right based on our sources. The Wikipedia timeline notes that almost right away, U.S. manufacturers and consumers started seeing higher costs.
Makes sense.
And the USDA report really digs into the financial pain for farmers. Plus, analysis from places like the Peterson Institute pointed to rising prices for intermediate goods.
Those are the components U.S. companies use to make other things.
Exactly. So businesses face higher supply costs, which likely get passed on to consumers eventually. And farmers saw their export markets, especially China, shrink dramatically because of the retaliation.
And the U.S. government stepped in with aid, particularly for agriculture.
They did. The USDA report details those market facilitation programs, MFP, and other aid. It totaled billions between 2018 and 2020.
Big.
Very big money. We're talking $23 billion just through the MFP alone. But, and this is a crucial point from the USDA report, even with all that aid,
It wasn't enough.
well, U.S. agricultural exports still took a massive hit, around $27 billion in lost exports from mid-2018 to the end of 2019.
And soybeans were the biggest part of that.
Overwhelmingly. About 71% of those annualized losses, something like $9.4 billion just for soybeans. Then sorghum, pork.
Why soybeans so much?
China was a massive buyer, and they could pivot relatively quickly to sources like Brazil and Argentina and South America. It really shows how interconnected global ag markets are.
And certain states felt it more.
Oh yeah. The Midwest got hit hard. Iowa, Illinois, Kansas, major soybean producers. And the USDA notes that even later, after the Phase 1 deal we'll get to, the U.S. market share in China didn't fully recover to pre-tariff levels.
That really paints a picture. And it wasn't just farming, right? There were wider economic ripples.
Definitely. Concerns about companies shifting supply chains out of China. This idea of decoupling.
Right, decoupling, less economic connection.
Yeah. And just general uncertainty, which tends to make stock markets jittery. The trade war certainly fueled talk among businesses about diversifying, finding alternatives to China.
And what about China's economy? Did it feel the effects too?
Yes, the sources indicate China also saw a slowdown in its economic growth and industrial output as a result of the trade frictions.
Okay, let's switch gears slightly to this bystander effect. The CEPR analysis suggested that for many other countries, the trade war actually created more trade opportunities, not just shifting trade.
That's a fascinating point. It wasn't just, say, Brazil simply selling the soybeans the U.S. wasn't selling to China. The idea is that the overall disruption created new gaps and needs in global supply chains.
So other countries could step in.
Exactly. They could fill those new gaps or become more attractive as alternative markets or suppliers. But the analysis also stresses it wasn't automatic.
Depends on the country.
Right. It depended a lot on a country's specific strengths. Could they actually scale up production quickly? Did they offer competitive alternatives? Country-specific factors really mattered.
Interesting. Okay, looking forward chronologically, let's talk about the Phase 1 agreement. Signed January 2020. This felt like maybe a pause or a step back from the brink.
It was framed that way by some. A key part was China committing to buy a lot more U.S. agricultural goods, among other things.
But how did that actually play out? Did China follow through?
Well, the USDA report does show a rebound in U.S. ag exports to China in 2020, helped by the agreement and some temporary Chinese waivers on their retaliatory tariffs. But there have been persistent concerns, highlighted again in that recent America First report, about China's overall compliance, not just on agriculture, but on other commitments too. Things like financial services access and protecting intellectual property.
So mixed results at best.
And like we said before, even with the rebound in farm sales, the U.S. market share in China didn't quite get back to where it was before the whole thing started, at least not in that first year after the agreement.
Which brings us to how U.S. trade policy itself has been shifting. The Trump administration used national security justifications, Section 232, and unilateral actions, Section 301, quite a bit for tariffs. How has the approach changed, if at all, under the Biden administration?
You know, what's really striking is the amount of continuity. Commentary we looked at, like from worldtradelawnet, points out that the Biden administration has largely kept, and in some ways even broadened, many of Trump's trade policies, especially regarding China.
Oh, really? So the core strategy hasn't changed that much.
The public messaging might be different, more focus on workers, middle class, securing supply chains, but the use of tariffs and other trade restrictions, that's remained a central tool.
And the new America First trade policy report reinforces that.
Absolutely. It lays out principles like actively reducing trade deficits, pushing back hard on perceived unfair practices.
Tariffs, non-tariff barriers, currency manipulation.
Right. and thoroughly reviewing existing trade deals. It even hints at potentially modifying or pulling out of agreements like the WTO's Government Procurement Agreement, the GPA.
To prioritize Buy American.
That seems to be the driver. There's a strong emphasis on Buy American policies,
Hmm.
and the focus on China remains intense concerns about their state-led economy, forced tech transfer, IP abuses.
Hmm.
It's all still there.
With the potential for new Section 301 investigations mentioned.
Yes, that tool is still on the table. The report also talks about assessing permanent normal trade relations, PNTR, with China, and there are legislative proposals floating around related to that.
And using national security, Section 222, more broadly.
It seems so. Beyond just steel and aluminum, the report suggests considering Section 232 actions for automobiles, maybe pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, critical minerals. It signals a more assertive, arguably more protectionist long-term stance.
Driven by both economic and national security worries, with China front and center.
That's the clear takeaway.
And all this is happening while the whole global trade landscape feels like it's in flux. Expert commentary talks about waning U.S. support for the WTO, for globalization generally.
That's a major undercurrent. The post-World War II consensus around free trade and a rules-based order, with the WTO as its anchor, it's definitely being questioned more openly now.
Why the shift?
Concerns about China's rise play a big part, but there's also a broader populist anti-trade sentiment that's gained traction in the U.S. and elsewhere. You see this debate playing out. Interdependence versus more national independence.
And more protectionism and industrial policy in the U.S.
Yes, partly as a way to compete directly with China's state-supported industries and to try and rebuild domestic manufacturing capacity. Geopolitics is now a huge driver of trade policy.
It must make things complicated for businesses.
Completely. How companies assess political risk for their global operations has totally transformed. It's not just about economic stability anymore.
Okay, finally, let's touch on the different views about this whole trade war. We mentioned the UN analysis saying it hurt both sides. Have others echoed that?
Generally, yes. There have also been calls, including from some economists, for the U.S. to build a coalition of countries to address China's trade practices collectively, rather than going it alone.
But initially, there was bipartisan support in the U.S. for the China tariffs?
There was, interestingly. It reflected a widespread disillusionment with Beijing's practices across the political aisle, but
Different groups felt the impact differently.
exactly. When you dig down, you find diverging opinions. Labor unions have often been more supportive of the tariffs. Farmers, many businesses, much more concerned about the negative consequences, the costs, the lost markets.
And what about U.S. allies?
Some allies have raised concerns, especially about the scale of recent U.S. subsidies for domestic industries, like in the Inflation Reduction Act or the GPS Act. They worry it's protectionist and might disadvantage their own companies.
And China's view.
From Beijing's perspective, the narrative is often that the U.S. is primarily responsible for the tensions. And it's worth noting reports about online discussion of the trade war being censored within China.
So, wrapping this up, it's clear the U.S.-China trade situation is incredibly multifaceted. Deep historical roots, major economic consequences still unfolding, and a U.S. policy landscape that seems to be signaling a real long-term shift.
That America First approach definitely suggests a more assertive, maybe more inward-looking trade strategy for the foreseeable future.
Which leads to maybe a final thought for our listeners to chew on.
Go for it.
Okay, so considering that the U.S. still has a persistent trade deficit with China, even after years of these tariffs and countermeasures, what are the really deep underlying reasons for that imbalance?
Good question. Are tariffs actually the best tool?
Right. Or are there other strategies, maybe complementary ones, that could be more effective? Strategies that could achieve a more balanced reciprocal trade relationship?
While still addressing the valid concerns about national security and economic prosperity here in the U.S.
Exactly. It pushes you to think beyond just the tariffs and consider the bigger picture, the fundamental drivers.
It's definitely something worth pondering. Lots of different angles to consider: business, consumer, farmer perspectives.
Absolutely. We encourage everyone to keep exploring, keep reading about the debates on globalization, protectionism, and just the future of this crucial U.S.-China relationship. Thanks for diving deep with us today.